God's been God a long time, but on the way to the top, God's rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. God's made many enemies, and somebody got pissed. Somebody's not happy. And now, what do you know? God is dead. I'm Larry Charles, and I want to know, who killed God?
Welcome to part 4 of Who Killed God. And I don't want it to sound like just another show. Oh, coming up next is Who Killed God, followed by 2.5 Men. No, this is a big deal. It's not just who killed God, it's who killed God! This is serious. In part 4, we talk about the evidence. This could be a short episode because honestly, there is no evidence. No tangible, traditional, conventional evidence, that is. But to me, that's a sign of how clever and cunning this crime is. How many unsolved crimes are there in the history of the world? Millions. Some of those are because there's no evidence. But sometimes there's a lot of evidence, but no one pays attention to it. If you have evidence, but people in authority dismiss that evidence, say that that's not evidence, that evidence is not good enough, then that's the same as not having evidence. Has a crime been committed if there's no evidence? The answer is yes. Numerous crimes have been committed, but because there's no evidence, they're never classified as a crime. We never even know about it. And that's the way the killers of God would obviously want it. They wouldn't want us to be walking around in our societies, in our cultures, in our world, thinking that God has been murdered. They just want us to think that everything simply goes wrong. That's the way it is, but nothing has changed. They don't want us to notice that something radical has shifted. A paradigm has shifted in our consciousness. They want us to believe that nothing has changed and everything is just as it was. That God is still here, doing what God does. The killers of God do not want you to know that a crime has been committed. That God is dead, and more importantly, that God has been killed. They want us to be fooled. They want us to fool ourselves. So yes, evidence will be elusive. It will be hard to come by. Proof will be difficult to obtain. But that doesn't mean that a crime has not been committed. That just means it's going to be hard to prove. And that's no reason to dismiss it or give up or to assume it's ridiculous. And you can't have a murder case without evidence. That's why the John Kennedy or the Robert Kennedy or the Martin Luther King assassinations have never been solved. There's plenty of evidence, but it's simply ignored. Instead, a patsy is blamed, and that's the end of it. Do we have a patsy? I'm sure the forces responsible for the murder of God have a patsy picked out should we get close to solving the crime. I'm sure if we get that close, a patsy will be offered up. But we're not going to fall for it. We're not going to fall for the Lee Harvey Oswald, James Earl Ray, Sirhan patsy solution. We're going to find and hold responsible the actual culprits for a change. When you think about evidence in a murder, you think of clues that would lead you to the killer and be able to prove that indeed the right killer had been caught. But here the evidence needed to start long before the crime. I didn't have a motive, I didn't have a weapon, I didn't have a body, frankly, I didn't have a clue. And speaking of evidence, I didn't even have evidence of God's existence. Maybe I needed to start there. It's a lot like UFOs. Some people are skeptical, some people are cynical, but some people believe. Some people believe that these visitors are from other planets. Some people believe they're from other dimensions. Some people believe they're mass hallucinations. But the truth defies one simple explanation. And many people simply don't want to believe what they should believe. And many people believe what they shouldn't. Where does that leave us? There's infinite untold explanations, and they may all be valid. What if everything's right and nothing's wrong? Or if everything's wrong, is nothing right? There's a phenomena called pareidolia. It's when people see things in other things. It's often how people assume they see God in a cloud or on a garage wall, or they see God in malformed vegetables. Is that evidence? You may scoff, but why? How do you know? Can you really be sure that God isn't giving us a sign by taking the shape of a cloud or a shadow on a wall or a deformed piece of cauliflower? Maybe we're not smart enough to take it seriously. Just because we give it a name, we call it pareidolia, doesn't mean it's not real. Maybe this is how you see God. You don't see God directly, you see God through other things. Some people assume they see Jesus in these things, but I always wonder, is it Jesus or is it young God? This is a question I've grappled with. Imagine you're God. You're really, really old, and yet you have to constantly compete with a younger version of yourself like a beautiful woman has to do as they age. Or Bob Dylan or Marlon Brando or Elvis. Constantly being judged and compared to the way you looked when you were young and having everyone conclude you look like shit now. That's why Jesus, like James Dean, has it easier because they both died young. So there's nothing to compare it to. Ah, eternal youth. That's what we worship. You can understand why Muhammad doesn't want any pictures. Who needs the hassles? And what about abduction stories? Are they true? Well, what do you mean by true? Well, did they really happen? Well, what do you mean by really happen? Our measurement of true and real is so narrow, it's no longer adequate to judge truth and reality. What about prophetic dreams, or mythical locations, or civilizations that predate recorded history? What about Atlantis? Does the Ark of the Covenant exist? What about the Holy Grail? What about angels and fairies? It's easy to say they're not real, but are you real? Am I? Is this? Is anything? It depends what you mean by real. When you're trying to solve a metaphysical mystery, like the killing of God, the answer may be yes and no. And nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to hear maybe, but that just might be the most accurate answer. Maybe, Judge, case dismissed. It's the inadequacies of the justice system that lets so many crimes go unpunished. Unless you follow these antiquated rules, you cannot solve a crime. You cannot have justice. That's not justice. That's a broken system. And a broken system perpetuates the status quo. It lets the powerful skirt around the rules, find loopholes, and never pay for their crimes. It's the status quo that would prefer we never find out who killed God, because to do so would upend the status quo. To find out who killed God would do nothing less than destroy the system designed to protect the guilty. Like, sure, it would be easier if you could take a picture with God on Hollywood Boulevard like you can with Spider-Man or Darth Vader, or at some tourist site. Step right up, get your picture with God. Maybe at a fair. That's me, that's God. Then you would know. But why should God make things so simple? Sometimes you wish he, she, it, they would. But as we've seen, nothing in this case is simple. And the Shroud of Turin, what is it? We don't know. Is it really the image of God or Jesus on some kind of a piece of cloth? Is it some sort of really bad stain that just wouldn't come out? Is God really that greasy? I mean, that wouldn't be shocking. You don't really ever see any images or read a text about God taking a bath. He's got to be covered in filth. People will say, look at the sky, look at a tree, look at a star. These are proof of God's existence. And I'm like, fine, but it won't hold up in court. Your Honor, the proof of God's existence is this tree. I mean, every tree? All trees? There are billions of stars. Is everything proof of God's existence? Or are there some things that aren't? If not, what are they proof of? Even worse, if the proof, the evidence of God's existence was at best circumstantial, then what hope could we have that the proof or the evidence that God was dead would be any better? And that God was killed? What lawyer in their right mind would take this case, you ask? Well, in truth, so many lawyers. The personal injury lawyers looking to cash in on your misery and suffering. Any lawyer who does commercials on TV. Has your deity been murdered by unseen forces? Call 1-800-KILL-GOD. Or has billboards. Is God dead? We're here to help. The guy that defends Ted Bundy. Trump's lawyers. They'll defend anything. They don't give a shit. Pay them and they will argue it in court. So I think due to the abstract nature of this case, in terms of God's existence, in terms of motives for killing God, and in terms of evidence, we have to take a slightly different approach. We have to be open to the idea of evidence that's not going to fall into traditional categories. We must open our minds to a different kind of evidence. You know, at one time, fingerprints didn't exist. At one time, DNA didn't exist. Now we take those things for granted. So we have to open our minds, our consciousness, to a new category of evidence. So let me present the evidence. Let's take world events as evidence. God sends manna from heaven to feed the Israelites crossing the desert. But now God lets millions and millions of people starve. If God could snap his, her, theirs, its cosmic fingers and have food pouring down from the sky anywhere in the world, why would he let even one little baby starve? Why does God allow war? Now you might say there are many wars in the Old Testament, and that's true. But how many of them involve one greedy, corrupt, powerful nation controlled by a small group of racist elitists who lie to their own people and the world about defending freedom when the only motive is power and profit, and falsely claim God is on their side in order to justify invading weaker nations, assassinating their leaders, killing innocent people, committing genocide, just to steal the natural resources and riches and territory? Ask yourself, why would God support a war like that? In the Old Testament, yes, it's true, God does give many people diseases, even an innocent person like Job. But when did God take millions upon millions of innocent people who've done nothing and affect them with terminal diseases that are causing mass deaths while allowing the wealthy to survive? Are you seeing a pattern? You see what I'm saying? This is evidence. This is evidence of God's absence. There's still slavery, and there's always been. One powerful group of people sadistically and cruelly enslaving others purely for their own gain. Yes, I know this has gone on for thousands of years, but remember, I am saying it's also possible that God was killed thousands of years ago too. This crime didn't necessarily happen last week. Why are people selfish and greedy instead of generous and sacrificing? Why would God allow human nature to go so far off the tracks? Why are there psychopaths and sadists? Unless you believe that God is a psychopath and sadist, why would he, she, they, it allow people like this to even exist amongst the good and the just and the righteous and the innocent and the nice? Is this how we're supposed to evolve? Would a just and loving God allow these people to flourish at the expense of everybody else? Think about those that have allowed pandemics to flourish and then reaped record profits from it. It could be powerful corporations or Machiavellian politicians. Wouldn't they want God out of the way? Isn't that evidence? Why does God allow man to suffer at the hands of other men? Why does God allow there to be perpetrators and victims, predators and prey? Why hasn't God at least given us the tools to fix these problems? And put aside the question of what humans do to each other for a moment, what about the fate of animals? Why did God go to the trouble of having Noah save 2 of every species only to let them be destroyed and made extinct and suffer at the greedy hands of man for food, for fun, for sport, for money? I mean, what was the point? You either have to believe that God doesn't care or God isn't here. And if God isn't here, where is God? Has God left the building? Or was God forcibly removed? Look, there are forces that want to exploit the world's problems. Then there are also forces that simply want to end the world. Are we saying that God has stood back for thousands of years and allowed evil in all its forms, from the small and petty to the global, flourish? Or is this evidence that God has been killed? Here's some damning evidence. God's own people, priests, gather ill-gotten wealth and abuse, sexually abuse defenseless children without consequences, all in direct violation of the promises they made to God. Wouldn't life be easier for the churches if there was no real God? Is that not evidence? So has God been killed because someone or some group feels or felt he, she, it, them had wronged them, hurt them, and thus God's murder was an act of vengeance or revenge? We have a lot of motivation, but not much evidence. Or consider this: has a benevolent God stood in the way of men, greedy, selfish, covetous men who wanted more, whose hubris drove them to get God out of the way so they could control the world and universe unfettered? Yes, it's true, there are no fingerprints, there are no forensics. But what does that prove? God is supposed to have made us in his image. Do we have DNA? Does God have DNA? Do we have hair? Does God have hair? Isn't God beyond hair? How about blood? Again, Jesus has blood, but does God? Teeth? Does God have teeth? Fibers? It depends who you ask. Fingerprints? Only as a metaphor. I'm beginning to think that evidence is overrated. How many bodies are found, and then there's no evidence, and that's the end of it? That doesn't seem right. Stuff is happening, and it just disappears. It goes away. It's ignored because there's no evidence. How can there be justice if evidence is the only criteria? And how often is there evidence and the evidence is destroyed or thrown away or dismissed or ignored? We see this happen again and again and again. We see it happen with war crimes, where there's a plethora of evidence and yet it's ignored, it's forgiven, it's justified, it's rationalized, and people go from being war criminals to being heads of state or having prestigious positions in government and private industry. Is that what evidence is about? What about these people who say things are actually getting better? Where are these people looking? I submit to you that they are co-conspirators, being paid off to make you think that what you see with your own eyes is wrong. This is why evidence is so hard to find. The evidence is there, but there are powerful forces who will stop at nothing, use any means necessary to make sure you never see it. And that includes the most damning evidence. So follow me here, because the evidence of God's murder is also the way to destroy the evidence. The destruction of humanity is the evidence of God's murder, but also the way to destroy the evidence. Destroy God's creation, and you destroy the evidence that God is dead. There's no one around to say, where's God? What happened to God? Meanwhile, the culprits are in underground bunkers or spaceships waiting for the toxic smoke and nuclear radiation to clear so they can have Earth to themselves. But as I get closer to something, a clue, a lead, anything, I keep hitting dead ends and brick walls, thwarted by the authorities and mysterious entities. And who are they? Who do they work for? One can't help but see a vast conspiracy. We are told, just believe, have faith, for our own good, for our own salvation. And at the same time, they keep telling us that God is alive, that they see God all the time. Stop looking so hard, stop asking so many questions, and then you'll find God. And if you don't stop, you might find something else, something much less pleasant than the Almighty. We are intimidated and threatened with a fate worse than death, eternal damnation. Well, it's not going to stop me. In fact, the more they try to stop me, the more convinced I am that I'm onto something, and the more committed I am to getting to the bottom of this metaphysical mystery. Most will think I'm just wrong, or crazy. But to me, it's the world that's crazy, and that's proof of the murder of God, and seeing that is the ultimate act of sanity. So I don't think I'm wrong or crazy. I could be, but I don't think so. The further away I get, the closer I am. The more I'm misdirected, the more directed I become. We know they're out there, the killers of God. The evidence is plain to see, even if it's invisible by our narrow judicial standards. Let's find these ultimate criminals and expose them. We can't let them get away with this. If they killed God, believe me, where next? If you think you have evidence, or know where evidence might be hidden or found, please leave a comment and let me know, and we will investigate. Don't ask who we are, I'm we, okay? Somebody saw something. Somebody knows something. Next time on Who Killed God, we will see what they saw and hear what they heard and know what they know in Part 5, The Witnesses. Until then, I'm Larry Charles, and I really fucking want to know, who killed God?